Welcome to Garden Success with Skip Richter, the show designed to help you have a bountiful garden and a beautiful landscape. Call in now with your lawn and garden questions at 979-845-5689 or email your questions to gardensuccess@tamu.edu. And now, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension horticulturist Skip Richter.
Well, hello and welcome to Garden Success. We are looking forward to a show that I'm really excited about today. I always enjoy having guests in here, and by the way, we are coming to you by tape, so don't try to call in. We are normally a call-in radio show, and we will be again next week. But today, just sit back and enjoy it, because we have someone who is a wealth of information on diseases, especially diseases of trees, and that is Dr. Dave Appel. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Skip. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. Probably not as much as I am. Dave is a professor emeritus and an extension program specialist with Texas A&M, and he has, his years of experience are just invaluable. It's one thing to look at the books and know all the official answers to things, but when you have years of actually touching plants, in this case touching the diseases of plants, you just come away with a wisdom that goes beyond, and that is something that is just hard to replace for sure.
Thank you, Skip.
Well, Dave, I actually have a question that I love to ask guests right up front, and that is, why and how did you end up getting into the field that you did? How does a young man suddenly decides this is what I want to do, and what was that process for you?
Well, I have always been interested in trees ever since I was a little boy, climbing trees, hanging around trees. I grew up in West Virginia. It's a rural state, and trees are very important to the state as an industry. And so when I went to West Virginia University, I wanted to go into forestry, and for several reasons, my advisor decided that I would be better suited for biology, and so I embarked on a biology degree. Okay. And I had the opportunity to take some electives, as you do as an undergraduate, and so I took a class in plant pathology. And that's when I got hooked. I was absolutely amazed with the idea that plants get diseased by germs, essentially, microorganisms. And I became fascinated with that. And I approached a tree pathologist that was in the Department of Plant Pathology at WVU. And we hit it off right away. And he had just happened to get a big grant on Dutch elm disease. And he was looking for 3 master's candidates. And
the rest is history.
That's exactly right.
Well, that is cool. I just find that interesting. We're going to talk today about all kinds of things regarding trees here in the community. We say at the Extension office that the 3 things that make the phone ring are the 3 T's: trees, turf, and tomatoes. Nobody ever calls me about their kohlrabi. But trees are just huge. And I just every day get at least one, if not a number, of tree calls because people get concerned, and they should be. The things that the value of a tree to the home, just the sometimes sentimental value, the value for shade, and making your place an enjoyable place to be outside, and it's really understanding that it'd be a major cause for concern. And we've lost a lot of trees. I'll say lately, but of course that happens all the time, cycles year to year and so on. And so I'd like to kind of enlighten folks today. I'd like you to enlighten folks today about how trees get into problems and the common problems that we find. So I think is that a good topic?
That's a very broad question, Skip.
It is.
But when you take a subject like tree diseases, there are literally hundreds of diseases of trees. Every tree out there is susceptible to one disease or another, and some of them are susceptible to dozens of different diseases. So I like to categorize all those different diseases into a simpler way to think about them. For example, and there's a number of ways to do this. This does not come out of my brain. We encounter these different categorizations all the time. But the one I like to use currently is that there are a number of diseases that trees live with and really don't do a lot of harm. Trees are like people. They get diseases that are minor, that they accumulate down through the years. There's one thing that tree pathologists always emphasize to people is that trees never heal. They always accumulate all of the environmental insults that they've been exposed to through the years. They carry that with through their entire lives. So we have many, many diseases that we call endemic or native to an area that trees have evolved with down through the eons, and they live with them nicely. Now we have the second category. We call these the emergent diseases. These are diseases that occur when something changes in the environment, and all of a sudden one of these endemic, I'll call it harmless pathogens, then becomes emergent on the diseases. Right. And these get people's attention then. These are the ones that all of a sudden they weren't there last year, and people say, wow, this tree just died overnight. Yeah. And that's where you start getting the phone calls. Right. And then we have another category altogether, which are the invasive pathogens. Okay. These are the diseases that or the pathogens that get introduced from another state. It can even be from another part of Texas sometimes. But they start invading into a tree population. And again, those are the really, really bad ones that get people's attention.
Well, an oak, Dutch elm disease you mentioned in your background, that's an example. Boy, when it hit the eastern seaboard, it changed things.
Dutch elm disease at the time, like another invasive that people are familiar with, chestnut blight. A lot of people know about that one. When those pathogens were introduced into North America, they changed a lot of things in agriculture, in the way that USDA had to start dealing with the realization that there were a lot of pathogens out there that are great threats to important commodities. So yes, Dutch elm disease was one of those.
Yeah, I remember a poem from childhood. Under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. Well, nobody knows what a chestnut tree is anymore around here. It's kind of like singing "Dashing Through the Snow" at Christmas. Nobody in Texas has ever dashed through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh. Yeah. But seriously, it did change things, and we have some diseases like that. We're going to talk about them today that have changed things here in Texas as well. One of the things that I think would be good to start with is oak decline, and just the whole concept of what is oak decline. Is it a disease? Why do we just look around town and see this or that oak is dying? You know, it's been there for years in my yard. Maybe there's 3 others around it and one's dying. What's going on? And again, there's a nice broad question for you.
Yes, we could, if we have a couple hours, I think we can thoroughly cover the topic. Let's talk about this word decline for just a second. The word decline in forest pathology does have a fairly rigid meaning. Now, we use it a lot in the common vernacular. People talk about declines all the time. People decline. But with trees, we usually, when we use the word decline, we think of a problem on the tree that has a number of complex interacting factors which are working on that tree. And again, we categorize these factors. We put them into these categorizations so that we can teach people about them, and also it helps us do research on them when we do that. So declines are a very familiar problem to tree pathologists. If you'd like me to go into what these categories are, I'd be glad to.
But just kind of a brief overview of idea, just so it helps us to think better about it. What you're describing to us and about to describe to us allows us to walk out and not say, "Oh, that tree just died overnight."
Exactly.
What killed it? It's much more complex and interlaced than that. So Go ahead.
Yeah, so declines, trees have this disadvantage that they are stuck in one place their entire lives. So they're going to be exposed to a lot of environmental extremes
Right.
that they can't get away from. So they're
Right.
going to have to compensate for these environmental extremes. For example, here in Texas, we've had some severe droughts in the past 10 years. We've even had a severe freeze episode that is a big problem for these trees. So these trees are living under stress. So that's one category, the predisposing stress, we call it, that these trees are exposed to. And then we have the inciting stress. These are the things like the very, very severe droughts and the very severe freezes that we've had. And these are affect a tree that's already been exposed to mild droughts and mild cold and all of the stresses that come along with the urban environments like soil compaction, overwatering, these sorts of things. And then we get these trees that are damaged by these very, very severe stresses. And then they get attacked by fungi that normally do them no harm. Now we come back to those native endemic pathogens that I was mentioning. These pathogens are sort of in waiting for the tree to become weakened so that they can again attack the tree and finish it off. So it's a very complex problem that we call the declines. And it isn't that we don't know what causes it. It's just that the specific factors change from one geographic location to the next. They also change from one year to the next because the climate is going to be different from one year to the next as well.
Right. Well, one of my frustrations in answering these kind of tree questions, why is my tree dying or what's going on, is that at the time that question is asked, there's not a lot I can tell them to do about it. If they were calling me before they planted a species in a location, we could direct them to a species that could handle that moisture soil or more prone to drought. If they called before they trenched for utilities around the tree, we could have done a lot to help with that. Or built the house and the tree got that bumper blight from not having its trunk protected. Or if they prior to compaction or prior to watering and taking that tree's root system to a point where you can't just spray something on it and make it go away. And that's what's so frustrating. So once they call, often there's not a lot I can tell them other than like the old doctor for the cold, get plenty of rest and drink enough fluids or whatever. In other words, just try to keep your body in a spot where maybe it can heal itself. Is that a fair analogy for trees? Or?
Well, it is a very difficult question as to let's say, for example, somebody has 8 to 10 post oaks in their front yard. The house has been built within the past 2 to 3 years. They've put in a St. Augustine lawn. They're in a development that has changed the overall hydraulic movement of water throughout the entire development, so that who knows, their lawn may be getting too much water, or it may be not getting enough water. But it can be frustrating to try to tell people what to do. But we do now have some recommendations depending on the specific site and what the stresses are that led to the problem in the first place.
Okay.
So we can take a look at the tree, we can look at the symptoms it has, we can get the site history, and then we can start making some recommendations.
Okay. Well, I think that would be helpful because this summer it just seemed like worse than normal, the number of trees that seemed to be dying. So go ahead.
If I could make a suggestion on it, just as an example, our post oaks, you mentioned post oak decline, people oftentimes plant St. Augustine grass right up to the base of the post oak tree. Now that's a very dangerous practice with post oak. The post oaks don't like to have wet feet.
Right.
So here's a simple recommendation, is if there are any remaining trees on the lot, then pull the St. Augustine grass back for several feet around the base of the tree. Get the grass back, put a very, very light layer of mulch, not too much. Don't make a volcano around the base of the tree because that's very, very hard for it. But put a light layer of mulch around that area. Don't come in and plant vinca or some other plant in there that's going to need water. And allow that area around the base of that post oak to remain dry. And that goes a long way towards helping some of these trees that are just starting to go into the decline, and also the remaining trees that are still healthy to be able to fight off the root rot organisms that would normally develop in that wet spot around the tree where the St. Augustine is getting watered.
That's interesting. I tend to anthropomorphize a lot when it comes to plants and things, but for me, an analogy is, three people go to a party, and two of them come back fine, and the other one comes back shaking the same hands and whatnot, breathing the same air, and they picked up the flu or a cold or something. And so many things like eating properly, getting plenty of sleep and rest and exercise, those all set us up for health, whereas the opposite sets us up for catching a disease. And I think with trees, it sounds like that may be what you're saying.
That, in part, that's the situation. We can, again, back to post oak decline, we have managed to do a little bit of research. And we know that the soil type that the post oak is growing on is extremely critical. And people don't understand soil type changes from their backyard to their front yard around here.
Yes.
And one of the big things is depth to clay layer. And if you have a lot that has a very shallow depth to clay layer, then that lot's going to hold a lot of water.
Right.
And the post oaks, if they start getting the overwatering, the normal watering for the St. Augustine decline, then those are the trees that are going to start suffering because the drainage isn't quite what they need to be able to, again, fight off the root rots that are going to inevitably start showing up on these trees with wet feet.
And it kind of makes sense because when you think about it, there's a post oak belt that runs kind of south and a little west to north and a little east as you kind of go through Texas, and a lot of the soils are more of a gravelly kind of soil. It may be drought prone, but it's not a swamp, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's a reason that they're native to that kind of area. Wow. Well, what are some general tips that you would give somebody who is trying to take a tree that now has problems and try to give it the best chance of recovery?
Well, it's always good to get a diagnosis, and I'll say call your county agent, and that's always a good place to start because in this case, if you don't know the specific answer, sometimes you can allow them to get to a different authority. But and we also have the Texas Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory here locally. We have the benefit of being able to just take some limbs and branches and leaves off the tree and carry them out to the clinic and fill out the form and pay your $35, and they'll give you some kind of opinion on it, a diagnosis. So that's really nice. Diagnosis is always the first step in getting a solution to a plant problem. And then after that, it depends on what the diagnosis is. Again, getting back to watering and lawns and concrete and these sorts of things around our trees, there is a treatment that we call vertical mulching that is very, very good for a lot of our tree problems locally here. And I won't go into the all the specifics, but nonetheless, you can Google vertical mulching, and you'll see that it involves drilling or poking a whole lot of holes around the root system of the tree, and then adding some kind of a supplement, depending on what the problem is. And sometimes the hole is the answer. It's not putting anything in the holes. It's just trying to get some aeration down into that clay layer, down to maybe 18 to 24 inches, and just getting some air movement down there, trying to get the feeder root system stimulated. Sometimes just a vast array of holes under the drip line of that tree will give it a lot of benefit.
So I want to take off on that vast array because I know people are trying to picture what on earth is a vertical mulch, and you're talking about drilling a hole that's not just like a 1-inch deep broom handle type hole. You're talking about something a little bigger.
2 inches in diameter is fine.
And about how deep typically?
Well, now that depends on what kind of soil type you have. Around here, we usually recommend 18 to 24 inches.
Oh, that's a very deep hole.
Yeah, around here that would be very deep. Now there are post oaks growing sitting on 6 inches of soil out in the hill country with caliche underneath them. So therefore,
they can't read. Those trees can't read. If they could read, they know they couldn't live there.
Yeah, exactly. You're right, and it's going to catch up with them eventually too.
Yeah.
But there, the holes that we recommend are as deeply as you can go. Sometimes it's 12 inches, and then you put a different kind of amendment out there than you would around here.
And back to the vast array, you're not talking about drilling 5 holes underneath a post oak tree. You're talking about holes that are like, what, a foot apart? Or
foot apart on 1 to 2 feet spacings on a grid, and you start 2 or 3 feet out from the trunk of the tree, and then you work it out, sometimes beyond the drip line. But a lot of times that where we're recommending this are on trees that have a driveway that was put in 2 or 3 feet on one side, so we only have a half a root system left on this tree to work with, and sometimes it's even less. But we have found down through the years that this kind of a treatment actually can turn trees around that are in danger of going into these declines.
Well, that's good. Very, very helpful. One thing that I often tell callers is if you interviewed a tree and said, how close to grass do you want to be? It would say, over the horizon. I don't want to see grass, period. With the point being, they grow in a forest. Well, I'm generalizing here, maybe not with a post oak so much, but a lot of trees grow in a forest where you have a lot of leaves on the ground that are creating a litter that's decomposing. It's protecting the soil. It's releasing nutrients and on and on. And it's a nice environment. And then when they get with the lawn right up to them, there's a competition. Plus, you mentioned the excessive watering that we do on our lawns, unfortunately, is just a death knell for a lot of trees.
Yeah, you are absolutely right, Skip. This, in a natural forest ecosystem, when we look at it, we need to recall that at one time that might have been a grassland. For example, a whole lot of Texas, when the early settlers came out, was grassland and savanna. And once we stop the fire control, or we start fire control, we overgraze and that sort of thing, the grass goes away and succession starts taking over, which ultimately leads to lots of trees. And if we come back in and start building around it and put grass in around these trees, we have, just as you said, put the competitor back there, which the trees have trouble competing with. Yes.
Well, that's interesting. Talk to me a little bit about some of the other diseases. I'd like to hear a little bit about oak wilt, because I know people the listeners probably have heard about oak wilt before. Tell us a little bit about what it is and how it gets in an oak tree, and how you prevent it. So.
Oak wilt is one of these issues that doesn't fit into my category, Skip. So you went right to. I was hoping to get questions that make me look good all the time.
Well, nature does that to me too. I give it a box, but it just sticks its arm or leg right out the side.
Yeah, oak wilt. We're not sure about where oak wilt came from.
Okay,
it's not like Dutch elm disease, and especially here in Texas, I have a hypothesis that it probably came from farther south, and during the last glaciation, it moved with the trees back up into North America from Central and South America. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence for this one, Skip, but I can usually support that claim, and we'll just leave it at that. We're not sure where it came from, but it is present in 22 other states. But if you look at the distribution, you have to look at it and go, wow, there's something going on here.
Yeah.
But we do have trees in our area that are susceptible to oak wilt, but we don't have a lot of oak wilt in Brazos County simply because the predominant forest type here is post oak. And post oak is very, very resistant to oak wilt. So it's very difficult for the epidemic to get built up around here. So we do have oak wilt. It's caused by a fungus, a very aggressive fungus, mostly on the red oak group, which are things like Shumard oak, pin oak. You get out in the hill country where oak wilt is epidemic, you have Texas red oak, blackjack oak, these sorts of things. So it's a very aggressive fungal pathogen, and it is a big problem in about 60 to 70 counties, mostly west of I-35.
Okay, and what does it do? How does it kill the tree?
Well, once the tree is infected, it plugs up the vascular system, and specifically the xylem water-conducting cells on the inside of the tree, underneath the bark. But it is only the outermost growth rings that are functional on a tree. However, so once this extremely virulent pathogen gets into that sapwood, we call it, it grows rapidly and just essentially plugs up the vascular system of the tree.
Yeah, so no water, so you might as well have pulled the tree up and set it on the sidewalk. It's in the same condition.
That's right.
It needs to pump water and it can't get water.
Yep.
So how do we fight it?
Well, we do have a control program for oak wilt. There are several things we can do. One of the best things is to prevent it coming into the area in the first place.
Okay.
And it gets moved around Texas by firewood an awful lot. The fungus is able to make its fruiting bodies. Think mushroom, only underneath the bark. But that's
like a mat of spores.
It's a reproductive phase, and it can be moved. These fruiting bodies can form on firewood, so that if somebody say somebody goes hunting out in the fall on a ranch out in the hill country, and there's somebody nearby selling firewood, and they say, "Gee, I'll take a load of that back with me," and they go back down to Houston with it and put it in the backyard. They don't burn it all up, and the following spring, that the oak wilt fungus, it's called Bretziella fagacearum, will make its spores on that wood and then move into the neighborhood right there. And so we get these outbreaks in Houston, in Lubbock, in Midland, outside the range, but a lot of that kind of movement is on firewood.
So are you talking about like green fresh cut firewood?
Yes,
that's
it's
coming
usually
in?
green.
Like if
Yes.
something is totally dry, is there a concern about the oak wilt coming in?
Well, this leads to one of our control recommendations. We recommend buying thoroughly cured wood to the point that the bark is just about falling off, and only use that.
Okay.
But we always caution people, if you've got some firewood from the hill country in your backyard, cover it with plastic the following spring.
And a clear plastic, right?
Yes, we use clear plastic.
Tell me
because,
why.
Well, it's because it's an insect that moves the fungus out of the firewood into your yard.
Okay.
And entomologists tell me, now I'm not an entomologist, and I caution you, I don't like to venture into entomology a whole lot, but entomologists tell me that if you use black plastic, they can see the light coming through pinholes and that sort of thing.
The light at the end of the tunnel, and they head for that.
Yes.
Well, that makes sense.
It has always made sense to me, so that's the recommendation I go with.
So with the clear, they just keep bumping against the window pane, and they can't find their way out.
And it's good to bury the edges of the plastic.
Okay.
And so that's one preventive measure for oak wilt. We have two others that people commonly use. One is to dig trenches around a disease center, and that's the way oak wilt spreads, because in addition to spreading by insects, it spreads through connected root systems between healthy and diseased trees, through the vascular system again.
So like two roots grew right beside each other, and as they got larger, they grafted or fused together, and then that's the pathway?
That's right. And then also with the live oak, it produces root sprouts. And so therefore, out in the hill country, again, used to be a grassland. The live oak took over once the pressure to produce grass was off, and the live oaks took over because they produce these root sprouts, and they maintain their common root systems through maturity. So in addition to root grafting, we have this added, even bigger threat of all these trees being connected through the common root systems. This is why it's a huge issue out in the hill country on live oak.
That's interesting, because that is a different strain of live oak, and some people may have noticed driving out there, unlike the southern live oaks where you typically see one tree, you see a lot of motts in those kind of areas, and that's kind of what you're talking about. It's a family.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And those motts back in the mid to late 1800s took off across the former prairie land, and that's why we have so many live oaks out there, and it's one of the reasons why we have so much oak wilt out there.
So two ways that a tree gets oak wilt are the roots connected to a tree that's sick. I'll use, here I go anthropomorphizing.
That's fine.
Again.
That's sick.
Or a beetle feeds on a spore mat on a red oak, and then comes and feeds on a wound on a
That's
live
right.
oak, not
That's
just
right.
a leaf or something that's a wound. So therefore, we've heard about, we shouldn't be painting wounds because that doesn't help the tree heal. But then we also finish that by saying unless you're in a place with oak wilt, and talk a
Absolutely.
little bit about that, painting the wound.
Well, yeah, the wound is, as you say, it doesn't have to be a pruning cut. It can be any kind of wound on
Okay,
the tree.
storm damage.
So the arborists always remind me, hey, it's not always us. There are a lot of other things that cause wounds, and they're absolutely right. And the wound has to be fresh. After about 72 hours, the wound begins to change. The surface of the wound changes. Yeasts and bacteria grow on it. The oak wilt fungus can't compete with those organisms anymore. So there's just a very brief window that wound is susceptible. But nonetheless, we have to get the pruning paint on it immediately.
So I'm supposing that fresh wound, there's a lot of volatiles that are going into the air, and the beetle smells that and heads that way.
That's how it works.
Is that how it works?
Yeah. So
I've always told people, when you're going to be treating oaks, that have a saw in one hand and the pruning paint in the other. Don't prune all your trees, go inside, make lunch, watch the football game that afternoon, come back the next day and try to spray them. It is really important to do it fast.
Absolutely, and that's one of the other key oak wilt recommendations. Normally, we tell people, if you're going to be wounding your trees, try to avoid the period from February 1 through the end of June. If you can delay having pruning done on your oak trees. Now, other tree species, it's fine, but if it's going to be oak species, then we usually recommend let's try to avoid it. Now, I know that trees have to be pruned year-round, so if you do have to have the pruning done, then make sure the wounds on the oak trees are painted.
So I think what you were saying is the coldest time of the year and the very hottest time of the year, because there's less beetle activity or less spore mat formation.
Less spore mat formation, less beetle activity, and also the trees are less susceptible then. The trees are most susceptible to infection during the spring because the very first growth of a tree in the springtime is the formation of the big vessels that carry the water.
Okay.
And since those are the vessels that are being formed during the springtime, if you wound into that wood, then it's easier for the fungus to grow through those large vessels in the sapwood.
Well, that is interesting. So I was not aware of how many places around the general Brazos County area had oak wilt at one time or another. But you were mentioning there's been quite a few centers, but right now it doesn't seem like we have this active thing like they see in the hill country where, you're watching your neighbor's trees die going down the street.
Yeah.
But that could come at any time.
If we were going to put a risk factor on Brazos County, it would be low.
Okay.
As opposed to like Kerr County or Gillespie County,
Right.
which it is extremely high.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, we've got so many diseases, so little time. So let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about elms. This summer, I noticed that a lot of elms were turning brown, especially the tips and edges of the leaf, which we usually associate with kind of a drought damage. But I think there's been several things going on. Can you talk about our elms? We've got cedar elms, we've got winged elms, we've got Chinese elm, all kinds of different elms.
Yes, our predominant native elm in the area is cedar elm, and we most of the calls we get and the samples we get in the clinic relate to the cedar elm.
Okay,
so
it's
I'm
a
going
good tough tree.
It is a tough tree, and no doubt about it. And but it does have a lot of disease problems. One of the knocks on cedar elm is that they always get yellow and brownish at the end of the summer, especially very dry summers. And there are some pathogens that are responsible for that. It's just that generally the cedar elms can pull through these kinds of episodes, but there are exceptions. But getting back to the specifics of what the problems are there, one of the really common ones is bacterial leaf scorch caused by Xylella fastidiosa, a bacterium.
Okay.
And it causes, you described it very nicely, that scorching around the edge of the leaves. This is a bacteria that acts somewhat like the oak wilt fungus. It plugs up the vascular system of the tree so that the fungus has trouble moving water.
Okay. Well, you are listening to Garden Success Today, and normally we're a call-in show, but we're coming to you by tape today, and we have a special guest, Dr. Dave Appel, a professor emeritus and extension program specialist, probably the foremost, I would say the foremost person I know that when it comes to trees and diseases, very popular speaker at a number of different events around the state and really beyond the state. But also, you're soon going to be a lecturer on the A&M campus again. Right?
Yes, I'm going to be going back to teach a little bit of forest protection.
That's fun. I may sneak in the back door and audit the back row or something.
I'd love to see you there, Skip.
All right. Well, thank you again for being here today. So you were mentioning the Xylella, and I'm going to come back to that one. But there's some other diseases that another wilt type disease that can affect elms.
Yeah, this one's really common. It's called Dothiorella wilt or native elm wilt. Now, don't get it confused with Dutch elm disease. It is a wilt disease, but it is a native pathogen. It wasn't introduced like the Dutch elm disease pathogen was. And this one is very common on our cedar and elms. We see it just about every summer on isolated branches on our cedar elms start turning brown. We call those flags. They appear gradually as transpirational demand gets really high on these trees. And the Dothiorella then takes advantage of the stress condition of the tree and it will start moving through the vascular system and killing branches like that.
Okay.
Again, I might add, this is one of those emergent diseases that is worse during dry summers.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the Xylella. That is an amazing disease that has changed Texas in many ways. Years ago when I was in Travis County, I remember driving out on the west side of town to some of those communities out west of Austin and seeing oleanders piled, they look like buses parked on the side of the road. I mean, giant piles of oleanders because everybody used oleanders everywhere because the deer wouldn't eat it. And when Xylella hit, I mean, it wiped it out. And it also has some other crops that it's impacted, and I'd like you to tell us about that.
This is actually a fascinating bacteria, and I could go on about it for hours as well.
I give Dr. Ong a hard time about getting excited about diseases that kill plants, but I'll try to tolerate that.
Okay, I probably should have used a different term, but it does have an extremely broad host range. Let's say, for example, the wine grape industry in Texas has to deal with Xylella.
Okay.
It causes a disease called Pierce's disease, and this is one of the major limiting factors for growth of wine grapes on the Gulf Coast.
Yes.
Because of the high level of Xylella that attacks the vines and kills them.
Yeah, when you think about wine and all the grapes, Cabernet, Sauvignon, and all these, the reason that they're not grown in College Station very long, very successfully is because of that disease. We have other grapes we can grow.
Absolutely. There are other varieties that have native grapes in their background that we can grow and make very nice wines from them. But if you're going to go with the European varietals, then you have to be aware that you're going to have a tough battle on your hand around here.
It's probably not if or it's when.
Yes.
When it
will come around. It's spread. The bacteria is spread by an insect, a very common insect. They're called sharpshooters, and so it's going to find its way around. Yes.
So if you wonder if you have sharpshooters, if you this summer were walking underneath your crepe myrtles and enjoying the cooling mist, you have sharpshooters. So they're everywhere, and like a mosquito would carry malaria from one animal to another, this insect is feeding on a Xylella-infested plant and bringing it in?
Well, they also feed on healthy plants too.
Right.
They're everywhere out there. Yeah. It's just that once xylella builds up in a tree and starts stressing them up, sharpshooters start getting attracted to the tree. So it's kind of one of these things that fuels itself.
Yeah.
And then the trees, if it's a tree, starts declining. Oleanders, as you say, are very susceptible in the landscape. Elms, our red oaks are very susceptible too. The shumards and pin oaks are susceptible. Sycamore, very susceptible to xylella.
So
yes.
the thing we call sycamore leaf scorch, where you're looking at a sycamore leaf and entire sections, usually a V-shaped kind of section, just turns brown. It eventually may work its way back even further.
That's xylella.
So is what's happening there, because I know with some plants, especially the oleanders and I know the grapes you were talking about, it's just a plant killer. But I see a lot of plants that survive with it. Redbuds is one that seem to kind of keep going. And so is it just a matter of it's plugging the plumbing, but enough is getting by to keep the plant alive, but then when we go into heat and drought, it can't keep up? Or how does that work?
Well, the best way to think of it is it is what we call an endophyte. This bacteria can live in the vascular system of a healthy tree in very low populations.
Okay.
And I'm talking about the bacteria is in low populations in the vascular system, and we're back to these native endemic diseases again. And the trees have evolved to live with these parasites in their vascular system. However, if the physiology of that tree changes, let's go back, freeze damage, severe drought, these sorts of things, if that changes, the bacteria, the population explodes inside the tree, and then it is liable to be picked up by the sharpshooters and start getting moved around in the tree population. And
it really is ubiquitous. All kinds of native plants, weeds around. So if it's kind of like it's not like it shows up at your doorstep. It's already running around the property.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's out there.
Well, speaking of ubiquitous and an opportunist, another thing that I don't know if I'm right about this, but I've been predicting we're going to see a lot more of it due to the drought and stress we had this summer, is hypoxylon canker. And it is an opportunist. So does hypoxylon come in from firewood, or tell us about hypoxylon?
Well, we just talked about xylella, so I'll use that as an analogy.
Yeah.
The hypoxylon canker fungus is also ubiquitous. Again, we're back to these endemic pathogens that become emergent. And it will move in and finish off, especially post oaks, if they get stressed. And this brings us back to oak decline. If the tree gets stressed, then hypoxylon atropunctatum is a fungus that will move in and finish that tree off very quickly.
Well, we're already getting calls on it. Someone sent me a picture of this dusty olive, tan, brown material that you put your finger on and it comes off on your finger, but the bark falls off and then that's behind it. And that would be one of the... There's some other looks that hypoxylon can have other than just that one described.
The very first look is as you put it, is the light brown dusty color. But eventually over time, if you leave that tree standing, which you shouldn't do, by the way, the tree should come down because it's weakened by the hypoxylon. But it turns a kind of a gray color. And then if you leave it standing for years and years and years, or if the tree is in the woods and it falls over, it will turn charcoal black.
Yes.
It almost looks like the tree has been burned.
Okay. But the gray is more of a hard surface, right? Than the soft spores coming off.
That's the fungal fruiting body that is formed there, so that that fungus can grow on that tree for decades because of that hard, crusty fruiting body that it makes.
So could you go out to a healthy tree in the forest around town and find that hypoxylon was present?
As a matter of fact, research in Arkansas has shown that up to 30 to 35, 40% of the trees, healthy trees out there, have hypoxylon growing in their underneath their bark. And as a matter of fact, research has shown in Europe that hypoxylon actually is good for the tree. It produces insecticidal compounds that ward off wood-boring insects. So we have a symbiotic relationship going on here. But once that tree gets weak, hypoxylon wants to be the organism that takes over, and so it will kill it off.
So we look and we say hypoxylon killed the tree, but really going back in time to earlier in our conversation, all these predisposing factors. May have been the wrong species for the site. Soil problems, compaction, drainage, and on and on and on. Cold damage, drought damage.
Yeah.
Everything just sets it up
Exactly.
for that. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're going to see a lot of it. I also think we're probably going to see more, and I know we're getting out of trees here, but more take-all root rot on our St. Augustine lawns that were stressed. I've noticed that when a lawn is stressed, that disease seems to be more of an opportunist on it.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it only does that, but
Mm-hmm.
We'll see. I hope I'm wrong about that.
Well, just to give a quick relevant example, the Yopon, prior to 2011, I had never seen hypoxylin on Yopon before. After 2011, hypoxylin showed up in 2012, 2013, killing the native Yopon off like crazy, and we had never seen it. Now, I had not. Maybe other people had observed it.
I still haven't seen it.
And now, if you look around when Yopon die and that sort of thing, I've noticed hypoxylin build itself up in the populations. Wow. So the way you described it is following these stress periods, we're going to see new hypoxylins show up, and research has shown that that's the case.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, well, this is all very interesting. We've kind of talked around this, but there is a principle in plant pathology called the disease triangle, and I think if you could describe that and explain it to the listeners, it would help not just with tree diseases, but it would help them understand the black spot on their roses and a lot of other things that go on out there in nature. Will you tell us about that?
Right. I spent a week on the disease triangle when I used to teach Plant Pathology 301.
A week?
A week on the disease triangle.
All right, well, we have 10 minutes, so
okay. So the disease triangle is a teaching tool, really, that plant pathologists came up with to try to explain the complexities of diagnosing and studying plant diseases. And the tool is the geometric figure, the triangle. And we say that there are three factors that always have to be present in order for a plant disease to become epidemic, let's say, for the disease to really break out. The first one is naturally a susceptible host. You're not going to have oak wilt if you don't have an oak tree in your yard. So that's one of the things. But notice, as I said, susceptible host. It has to be susceptible to the diseases that we're concerned about. The next is going to be the pathogen has to be present. Now, there is an axiom in plant pathology that most pathogens are already present out in the environment. It's just that we don't notice them. And this is true of many of the landscape pathogens that we have out there. Entomosporium on your what's the shrub I'm trying to think of?
Indian hawthorn,
Thank you.
red tip photinias.
Yeah, like I said, I'm a tree guy.
Okay.
But let's say Entomosporium on Indian hawthorn's always out there. It's just some years you see it, and other years you don't see it.
Yeah.
And so so most pathogens are always there. And then finally, the third part of the triangle, the third apices, the point on the triangle, would be the conducive environment.
Okay.
The environment has to be right for the disease to occur. And if any one of these is not in, let's say, that state of being that allows the three factors to work together, then you're not going to see the disease that year.
So I like to think of it as a stool. All you have to do is cut off one leg of the stool and it falls over.
Stool's no good anymore.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Indian hawthorn. That's a good example of the disease triangle because while they are susceptible, if you move them into shade versus sun, and if you start having your pop-up sprinkler in the shrub bed wet the foliage, it just 10 times worse than it is out in a dry, sunny location.
And this is why we always tell people that if all of a sudden you start noticing something going wrong with your plants, think of this disease triangle first. Think of the total growing environment that you've put the plant in, and then start asking yourself, what about this site could be allowing this disease to develop here?
Seems like over the decades that I've been doing horticulture, I've watched a shift from there's a problem, let's spray it and kill it, to more of a let's develop plants that don't get that problem. We see it in roses now. Oh my gosh, there's so many nice disease-resistant roses. Maybe not disease-proof, but disease-resistant. And that just makes sense, right?
Absolutely.
If you want to plant a tomato, what kills nematodes in the soil? Well, the wrong discussion. What kind of tomato doesn't get nematodes? Plant one like Celebrity, which is one of our Texas superstars now. That's a VFN type tomato.
And it's my favorite for that very reason.
Yeah.
You're right. It's in my garden.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, so as those of you listening, think about that when you look at problems in your yard or that you might encounter. Just think about those three things. Sometimes getting rid of the pathogen, other than spraying, killing it, is kind of difficult because they're so ubiquitous, as you were saying. But finding a plant that doesn't get it, or looking at what are you doing in the environment that makes it worse. And I know with St. Augustine, we can do a lot of things that increase both disease and insect issues with that plant.
It's true of all the plants, including the trees that we started out with. Exactly right.
That is interesting, the disease triangle, foundational for that. Well, we've talked about a lot of the common diseases that we're dealing with here. We'll only scratch the surface, actually, but of trees. But tell us about some of the things you see on the horizon. You mentioned early on that these things that come in new are often the worst things to deal with. I think you said that. And tell us what kinds of things you see out there that might be on the horizon.
Well, sometimes we get taken by surprise, and so there are things that we don't realize that are there. We've had one in Texas in the past few years that has invaded from the east. It is a fungus called Raffaella loricola, and it attacks red bay trees.
That sounds like a salsa dancer or something.
It's one of my favorite pathogen names.
That's a beautiful name. I love that. Raffaella.
Exactly. Yeah, but it invaded in South Carolina in 2002, and do you know, within 13 years it had worked its way down the East Coast into Florida, attacking avocado because avocado is in the Lauraceae, which red bay is in.
Like the laurel family?
Exactly,
okay.
The laurel family. And so it spread all the way down the East Coast. It spread across the Gulf Coast, and it hit Texas in, I think, 2013. And now it has shown up in urban environments in North Harris County, wiping out red bay trees.
Yes.
Which is a very important, beautiful shade tree in East Texas.
Yes, it is. Can you think of any plants that might be, or any trees that might be in this area or west of us that might be susceptible to it?
That's the peculiar thing about this. Except for the Gulf Coast, red bay does stretch along the Gulf Coast down towards Corpus Christi. And we've been having people saying, now they're finding it along the coast, but it hasn't been proven yet. But not really. This is going to be one peculiar to a certain small family. Sassafras in East Texas is very susceptible to it. That's where it was first found on sassafras, as a matter of fact, in East Texas.
Is that the original root beer? Or
I don't
know.
Could be.
I know it's the filet and gumbo, right? Sassafras leaves ground up.
Yeah.
Well, those kind of things are always a concern. Let's talk a little bit about, just in general, plant pathology principles. What are some things that you might consider if you were buying a tree for your yard to plant? What are some species that you might feel a little bit better about? And I realize, there's 100 things you can answer, but just for you yourself. And what are some other things that you would recommend someone consider so that down the line, 20 years, 30 years from now, when they've got this beautiful shade tree, there's no regrets at something that should or should not have been done early on?
Yeah,
how's that for a broad question?
Yeah, it's one of those tough ones. I have my personal choices, and then I have the things. It's often easier for me to say what don't plant.
Okay, well,
but I'm going to start with one tree that I really like in the Brazos County area is the bur oak. Bur oak. People have a knock against it. They say, "Oh, it's so slow growing," but if it is watered properly, then it grows every bit as fast as a primarily live oak. And live oak's a good selection. I know we have a lot of them, but we have a lot of them because they're very low maintenance.
Yes.
They do really well, so you're going to see a lot of those around. I'm trying to think beyond that list. I know chinkapin oak has been popular, but during the freeze, chinkapin oaks really got nailed hard. I don't have any numbers on it, but I'm a little hesitant about chinkapin oak again, right now. I know, bald cypress is so popular because a lot of our front lawns are very close to a swamp, but they really got nailed during this year's drought. We're seeing a lot of mortality on the bald cypress. And I often recommend people go to the Texas Forest Service website and go to the Texas Tree Planting Guide, and gosh, it's just a wealth of information about what to plant.
I wish I had that on top of my head. It's like texastrees.tamin.edu. I can't remember the URL, but it's something simple.
If you just Google Texas Tree Planting Guide with the Texas Forest Service, you'll get it immediately.
And it is a wealth of information. You see how to plant a tree, you see the basics of how to prune a tree, and then they have a list of all the trees that they would suggest.
County by county. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that is helpful. I guess one of the things horticulturally that I see is how trees are planted. They come out in a container. A tree that normally would have roots going 20 feet out in all directions is all wound up now in a 5-gallon bucket, and all the issues, planting too deep and other things that, again, just predispose and create problems.
And we usually recommend natives. I mean, that's a good rule of thumb to stick to the natives, although there are some introduced trees, I have to admit, that going around the state do very well, and they don't have that problem of escaping out into the natural woodlands. It's not like Chinese tallow along the Gulf Coast and that sort of thing that have created enormous economic problems.
That is true. One that non-native that I really enjoy is Chinese fringe. We have one up at the DIG, the Demonstration Idea Garden. I don't know, you may be aware of some big diseases on it, but it doesn't get too big, so it fits modern lots well. It has beautiful white spring blooms, as does the native fringe, Grancy Graybeard.
The Mexican oaks are getting popular now, too, and they don't escape, and they seem to do pretty nicely.
Well, I tell you, we could go another hour or two, Dr. Appel, but thank you so much for being here today and for visiting with us. It's been a wealth of information and entertaining as well.
Of course. My pleasure, Skip. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, we've been talking with Dr. David Appel, Professor Emeritus and Extension Program Specialist here at Texas A&M AgriLife. And I hope you enjoyed the show. Tell your friends about it. And remember, you can listen to past shows online, or you can now podcast these shows. So check your podcast provider and look for Garden Success. And we will look forward to seeing you again next week. We'll be coming back live again.
You've been listening to Garden Success with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension horticulturist Skip Richter. Join us again next week as Skip discusses your questions about gardening and landscaping in the Brazos Valley.